Welcome to Life Empowers with Melissa Oden. Where there is life, there is hope. Where there is life, there's a place for love to grow, and love emboldens and strengthens. Where there is life, there's an opportunity to grow and be empowered. I'm living testament to that, and you are too. And if you don't yet feel like your life is testament to this, don't despair and don't stop listening to this podcast. This is exactly why I'm doing it. Thanks for joining me this week as we delve into so many life-affirming topics. I've been thinking a lot that since this podcast is entitled Life Empowers, maybe I need to back up a little bit and even talk about why I came up with that title. You hear me talk about it as I close every podcast, that life empowers, not abortion. But I think we need to even back up further than that to say, where does that verbiage, right? Some would say rhetoric, where does that language come from that equated abortion with women's empowerment? Some people probably know this about me. I mean, people who know me really well. When I first started sharing my story publicly, I was speaking with Feminists for Life of America. I went through this process after finding out my own story of surviving an abortion and really wrestling for years about whether I could be a feminist and be a survivor of abortion, because I had never met anybody like me at the time who was pro-life and feminist, and certainly wasn't taught in school, right, that the first feminists were pro-life. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, all of those suffragists. And so I went through this process of searching and wrestling and wondering and questioning. And then when I found Feminists for Life, that changed my life. And at the same time, they were asking for college speakers. And so that's really how I came into the pro-life movement, which to me is not a coincidence, right? I think that is so beautiful that for somebody like me who wrestled with feminism and whether that fit with being an abortion survivor and having to find out the truth about true feminism and being pro-life, it's so beautiful to me that I was given that opportunity to be with Feminists for Life when I first started sharing my story publicly. And even though my story, what I know about it, right, through meeting my birth mother and hearing from medical professionals who cared for me, even though some of those parts have of course evolved in what I know about my own life story, what has never changed is the fact that I believe that abortion harms women, and not just survivors like me, not just unborn little girls, but also women. And you know, in my heart, all these years, I've believed what a travesty it is that we live in a culture that has somehow told women that we have to choose. We have to choose between our education and being a mother. We have to choose between being quote unquote successful and being a mother. We have to choose between relationships and having our child, all of those things. And so that's so interesting to me. That, of course, that part of my story, that belief of mine has only grown and been intensified through my experiences. So I wanted to talk a little bit in this podcast about pro-life feminism. And, you know, it was really interesting to me because I do a lot of studying. That's what I enjoy doing, I guess, in my free time. And even though one of my favorite books, if you haven't checked it out yet, one of my favorite books when it comes to pro-life issues and feminism in particular is Subverted by Sue Ellen Browder. Excellent, excellent book. So the title again is Subverted. And so that is a really favorite book of mine. And I wanted to do a little bit of digging, though, to see what I could find on the web about feminism and pro-life issues. And I stumbled across a really interesting article entitled Feminism and Abortion from the Atlantic Monthly from April 1990. And the author is Martha Bayles, Bayles. there's some just really poignant pieces in this. And so, knowing that this is a podcast and I get to do the legwork for you, I want to read to you part of her synopsis in the Atlantic Monthly, because I think it really points back to why I've entitled this podcast Life Empowers, and, truly why I believe in pro-life feminism, the third wave of feminism that says, women do not have to choose. We should not be living in a culture that makes us choose. And really, abortion is a reflection, as Sarah Foster with Feminists for Life often says, abortion is a reflection that we have not met the needs of women. But I think we need to take a step back and see, where did this all start really coming together? This tenet of feminism and pro-choice, right? Because it's just so solidified now. And so in this article, here's what the author Martha Bales says. This first opening line is so powerful. Sandra Day O'Connor has observed that Roe v. Wade is on a collision course with itself. Justice O'Connor was referring to medical advances since 1973 that make it easier both to destroy potential life and to preserve it. Her meaning is vividly illustrated by those rare but disturbing cases in which a second or third trimester abortion yields a living infant, which must then be either killed or rushed to another part of the hospital for the latest in neonatal care. Ding, ding. I mean, who's she talking about there, right? I know a few things about that. Fascinating. But she goes on and says, but Justice O'Connor could just as well have been referring to the contradictions at the heart of contemporary feminism. So let's get to it. What does she have to say? She says, contemporary feminism began as a revolt against the traditional female role, as it was experienced by the generation of college-educated women who in the 1950s attempted to make a full-time occupation of domesticity. To a large extent, it was inspired by Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. You'll come across that a lot in the book Subverted, which began as a survey of Friedan's former classmates at Smith and grew into a polemic about the psychological frustrations experienced by women who exchanged the relatively egalitarian world of the college campus for the quote-unquote comfortable concentration camps of middle-class suburbia. Restless and sometimes envious of their husbands' careers, Friedan's trapped housewives wanted to pursue the basically liberal goal of freedom and autonomy on an equal basis with men. Soon a movement arose to break out of the stifling private sphere inhabited by females and enter the breezy public forum dominated by males. But she goes on to say this: a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Try as they would, the feminists of the 1960s and 70s could not extirpate the reality of gender differences. For the radical fringe, the persistence of such differences was proof that female oppression was the most deeply ingrained injustice in history. Metaphysical cannibalism, as Ty Grace Atkinson called it. But mainstream feminists did not feel drawn to this sisterhood, which was based on hatred for the essential experiences of womanhood. Beginning in the universities, many of them sought ways to accept gender differences without sacrificing equality. Here's where it gets interesting to me. She goes on and shares, the original pro-choice argument is rooted in the classical liberal affirmation of every man's right to own his own body. I want to say that again. The original pro-choice argument is rooted in the classical liberal affirmation of every man's right to own his own body. Critical of liberalism for its failure to extend this right equally to women, pro-choicers define abortion as the essence of every woman's right to own her own body. Did you hear that? Sounds like something we hear and see time and time again. My body, my choice. In Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood, Kristen Luker's 1984 study of attitudes on both sides of the abortion debate, one activist put it this way: we can get all the rights in the world, and none of them means a doggone thing if we don't own the flesh we stand in. The obvious objection to this argument is that a fetus is not just part of a woman's body. We say this a lot, right? For a while, pro-choicers tried to meet this objection by dehumanizing the fetus. Not yet a human, just a clump of cells, a blob of tissue, right? We've heard all those arguments. Some still make them. She goes on and she talks about the case of a physician. She says, for example, Jane Hodgson, the Minnesota physician who is currently challenging that state's, back in 1990, parental notification law before the Supreme Court, told the Washington Post that one way to assure a patient after a first trimester abortion is to show her the pan of the uterine contents. Dr. Hodgson also refers to the object of such a procedure as a few embryonic cells. By using such phrases, the 74-year-old Hodgson is echoing the tones of an earlier era. I would agree to that, wouldn't you? By using such phrases, the 74-year-old Hodgson is echoing the tone of an earlier era. In the face of the passionate rhetoric of the pro-life movement, her words, not mine, obviously, to say nothing of public opinion, which has never wavered in its support of tighter restrictions on later abortions, pro-choice activists have nothing to gain from using such clinical and dehumanizing language. I'm grateful that she said that. The more up-to-date pro-choice arguments, up-to-date, don't you love that, are rooted in superiority feminism's elevation of the private morality of women over the public morality of men. This is where it gets really interesting, so make sure you're listening here. In the spirit, pro-choicers define abortion as an intensely personal experience that no man can judge. Still hear a lot of that today, don't we? No uterus, no opinion. How many times have you seen that sign in places? Bella Abzug anticipated this view in 1980 when she attacked Jimmy Carter's personal objections to abortion as biologically inappropriate. With this phrase, Abzug reveals the bogus logic of declaring the subject of abortion off limits to men. Since when has biology determined the arenas in which human beings can make moral judgments? Do you want me to say that one again? I love this question, this statement. Since when has biology determined the arenas in which human beings can make moral judgments? Boom. But she goes on and says, in a similar vein, pro-choicers define abortion as a family matter that is no business of politicians. Ding, we hear that one still today too, don't we? But I love what she goes on to say. Thus, the claim made before the Supreme Court by the ACLU that the Minnesota law, back then in 1990, requiring notification of both parents in cases of teenage abortion, tramples on the integrity of families. And thus Planned Parenthood's insistence that cuts in federal funding for abortion counseling are a quote-unquote outrageous assault on the American family. To clarify the doublethink in such rhetoric, because are you confused right now? I am too, after just having to read through some of those statements, even though I hear them all the time. As I'm reading through them, my brain is just scrambled right now. But the writer goes on to say, to clarify the doublethink, consider the language used by the Appellate Division of the New York State Supreme Court. It would have been back in 1990 or 1989, likely, that she was referencing, in ruling against two pro-life activists who tried to prevent an abortion on a comatose woman named Nancy Klein. For anybody who needs a spelling on that, if you want to look up the case, the spelling is Nancy, Nancy, Klein is Klein. The abortion had been sought by Klein's husband in consultation with her parents and her doctor in the hope that it would increase her chances of recovery. The court said that absolute strangers to the Klein family, whatever their motivation, have no place in this family tragedy. Appropriate though this language may be to the unhappy case of Nancy Klein, it is also misleading. In exactly the same way that the pro-choice activists' pro-family, anti-government rhetoric is misleading. Quote-unquote absolute strangers are not the only people who have, quote-unquote, no place in abortion decisions. If Klein had not been in a coma, she would have been legally entitled to decide between destroying and preserving this unborn life without consulting either its father or its grandparents. All the pro-family rhetoric in the world cannot change this blunt fact. After Roe versus Wade, abortion is not a family decision. It is the decision of one class of individuals, pregnant women, who have been designated, in Orwell's pithy phrase, more equal than others. What do you think about that? Have been designated more equal than others. Trust me, I have faced that. No matter how many times I've testified before a state legislator or even before Congress, I have been told that as a woman, I have a right to have an abortion, but as an abortion survivor, I never had the right to be born in the first place. Absolutely crazy, twisted logic. But she went on, and I think there's some really important pieces that this author talked about. I hope you are able to hang in there with me because I found this article just absolutely fascinating. She went on to talk about the mater familias. She said, granted, there's nothing new about granting a class of people with life or death power over their families. Such is the original definition of patriarchy. We hear that a lot too when it comes to abortion, right? Fight the patriarchy. Okay, so let's hear about the patriarchy today. In ancient Rome, for example, a great many political, economic, and religious powers resided in the male heads of tribes, clans, and households. Among these was the power to commit infanticide. If a newborn was deemed healthy and supportable by the paterfamilias, it was initiated into the family with the proper rites. If not, it was smothered or drowned. In Rome, infanticide was not considered murder any more than abortion is considered murder by the majority of Americans today. Although I think we find about 50-50 right now. If you polled people in the United States, at least that's what some of the last polling looked like that I saw. But the Romans regarded infanticide as a very grave act, which is why it could not be performed only by the paterfamilias, in the sense that our present abortion law vests the pregnant woman with the power to commit a similarly grave act. It's tempting to dub her the quote-unquote mater familias, right? But of course she is nothing of the kind. The stern powers of the paterfamilias were fused with stern duties, such as atoning for crimes committed by the members of his household. In the organic metaphor we've inherited from the Romans, by way of Christian views of natural law, the members and the heads of families and other social institutions are bound by ties so powerful that they can be severed only by a kind of amputation. Since the 17th century, this organic metaphor has been challenged by liberalism's depiction of social institutions not as organisms made up of consanguine parts, but as contractual arrangements between consenting individuals. The feminist complaint against liberalism is that it has never, despite its contractual ethos, stopped conceiving of the family as an organic institution. As the political philosopher Susan Moeller-Oken has put it, liberalism still takes a prescriptive view of woman's nature and proper mode of life based on her role and functions in a patriarchal family structure. That is why the chief goal of feminists like Oken, OKIN, is to restructure the family as a totally contractual arrangement from which anyone, but especially any woman, may withdraw at will. But is this goal morally defensible? There's a very good reason why liberalism has never stopped seeing the family as an organic institution. Beginning with John Locke, liberalism has understood that not all human ties are contractual, most notably the tie between a parent and a child. Locke distinguished between legitimate political power, which may extend to life and death because it derives from the consent of the governed, and parental power, which may extend only to preserving the life of the child because it does not and cannot derive from the consent of the child. This crucial distinction collapses every time pro-choice arguments flip-flop between the language of individual rights and that of nurturant femininity. Pro-choicers begin by asserting equal rights for women, a line of reasoning that challenges the organic basis of family relationships. But equal rights are not enough when it comes to abortion, a decision that must balance women's rights against those of others, such as fetuses and family members. So pro-choicers define women's rights as more than equal, on the grounds that female decision-making partakes of a special moral wisdom. Isn't that so true? Isn't that what we hear all of the time? That women have this special wisdom as they're making this decision that men in particular just quite simply cannot understand. She goes on to say, but what is the source of that wisdom? Important question, isn't it? Not women's character or achievement as individuals, but their membership in a class whose nature it is to care for others. A definition of womanhood that is nothing if not organic. I love that. By such maneuvering, pro-choice advocates can usually avoid admitting that the relationship between a woman and a fetus is not contractual. But if not contractual, then what would it be? Then it must be organic, an outcome that leaves pro-choicers with only two options. They can deny the humanity of the fetus, which is both unpopular and unproductive. Or, drum roll please, what can they do? They can change the subject. She sees it, she admits it, right? So either deny the humanity of the fetus, deny the fact that survivors exist in the world, deny the fact that our rights to life were trampled on, deny the fact that we were human beings, right? Or they can change the subject. So what do you think you see a lot in the world today? Usually it's changing the subject, right? Diverting, going to a different place of argument. But she goes on to say, and why do they do this? Because the comparison between maternal and fetal consent favors the fetus. The logical solution is to shift to a comparison that favors the woman. That is, between the degrees of consent exercised by men and women having sex. In its wisdom, which has remained remarkably consistent over the years, public opinion tolerates legal abortion in cases of coercive sex, such as rape and incest. But this consensus is not good enough for those pro-choice activists who have an overriding rhetorical need to stress female as opposed to fetal helplessness. I thought that was an interesting, powerful statement. She said their hypocrisy peaks when, after granting women life and death power over the unborn, they depict sexual relations as beyond women's control, in rhetoric that harks back to the old militant equation of sex and rape, as expressed by the activist who told Kristen Luker that without abortion, women would have about as many rights as the cow in the pasture that's taken to the bull once a year. Head hitting desk right now for me. She goes on to talk a lot about this, but I want to keep it short because you can certainly find this old article by looking it up on the internet. But she says, as she goes on, we now arrive at the real legacy of feminist doublethink, with its contempt for the values of the unliberated majority and its misplaced faith in the superiority of female moral reasoning. Substitute feminist superiority for female superiority, and the actual tendency of the movement becomes clear. Let me say that again in case you missed it. Substitute feminist superiority for female superiority, and the actual tendency of the movement becomes clear. Not only does feminist doublethink accord women the exclusive power to terminate potential life, Okay, I disagree with that statement, right? Potential life. It is life. Life with potential, not potential life. But this is still a good article. Not only does feminist doublethink accord women the exclusive power to terminate potential life while absolving them of any responsibility for having conceived life in the first place, this doublethink also extends its influence by way of the helping professionals and judges under its sway, boom, 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 over the poor, the confused, and the underaged, who are urged to heed the feminist message over the advice of their own families. That's powerful, isn't it? Man, this article has just been chock full of some really powerful statements. Nor is this power being exercised in the name of a clearly defined kinship group, as was the power of the Roman paterfamilias. Rather, it is being wielded in the name of all women, a category that includes not only the majority of people who disagree with a pro-choice position on abortion, but also half, and she goes on to use potential lives again, right? But also half the potential lives, I'll say lives with potential, being aborted. It's a measure of feminist fanaticism that only recently a pro-choice activist announced their unwillingness to defend abortion as a method of sex selection. And you know what? I guess I would even revamp that to say, I don't even see much of an outcry about sex selective abortion. Because again, what is the response? It's avoid the conversation, right? Perhaps it occurred to them that sex preferential practices have historically favored the male, and that by sanctioning such abortions, they are quite likely causing fewer females to be born. I would like to see more pro-choice activists decrying this, being willing to speak out against this. But she goes on to say, if this was their reasoning, then it's time to stand back and watch feminism collide with itself. Isn't it time to sit back and watch this feminism collide with itself? I'll let it collide with itself while we, of course, build this wave of feminism that acknowledges that this should not be an either or when it comes to women and children. This is a both and that harkens back to those original feminists, the suffragists, who saw that abortion was an exploitation of women. So check it out. Again, the article is from 1990 in the Atlantic Monthly, Feminism and Abortion by author Martha Bayles, Bayles. And again, if you're looking for a great book this summer to read, I highly encourage you to read the book Subverted by Sue Ellen Browder. Let me know what you think. This has been an interesting, heavy, but important podcast. Have a great one. Thanks for joining me this week on Life Empowers. I hope you found our time together to be life-affirming, hope-building, encouraging, informative. And remember, the next time someone states that abortion is empowering, you know better. Life empowers. See you again next week.